Hey guys, this is a narrated version of our lesson plan example for this week. I just thought it might be good to go through and talk about the different components of this lesson plan, how it came together, and explain how they connect. If you look at the first few sections here, the lesson title and topic, of course you select that. You can just put the title or the topic or both, that's okay. Author. If you look at the content areas, you'll see that this particular lesson plan utilizes multiple content areas. You don't have to do that with your lesson plan, but that is an option. And oftentimes integrating between content areas is a way to make your lesson plan a little more meaningful and the activities a little more easily retained by students. If you look at the unit, this is really kind of an optional component for your lesson plan. A unit is a larger collection of lessons put together into an overall plan of study. Oftentimes a unit takes a week or several weeks, so lessons will fit into a unit. What you're doing is just planning a lesson, and you can think about a unit, like for example this would be a good lesson to use in an overall unit about economics, but you don't necessarily have to at this point. Dates, I just put a rough estimate for that. Grade level, this is a lesson plan designed for either 3rd or 4th grade. Time frame, this is a lesson plan that would take about 2 days. If you had a little longer block of time, you could probably do it in 1 day. And sometimes, things don't go the way you plan them and you have to wind up doing 3 days. But generally speaking, a lesson, quote-unquote lesson, should not take more than 2 days. If you're going beyond 2 days, then that's really more of a unit that you've planned. Most lessons are kind of 1-day deals, but of course, to make them a little more meaningful and project-based, it's good to have them go over several days. But the lessons are the individual components, and they should be shorter in time frame. I planned it on my own, so that would be independent, but depending on how you do that, you want to check off that. The standards that we've talked quite a bit about, this lesson plan utilizes 3 different standards. It comes from the Kansas Social Studies standards, Math standards, and English Language Arts, ELA standards. For the Kansas History and Government Social Studies standards, a standard has been included, as well as a benchmark with the code and the description. It's good with the social studies ones because they're written a little more general, but then the way they're broken apart by grade level is pretty specific, to include some kind of content standard with that as well. These can be found under the particular grade levels, and content just refers to the actual knowledge that you're teaching students. And so in this one, even though that's a 2nd grade content area, in social studies it's okay to float around a little bit between grade levels in terms of the content you're teaching. Oftentimes social studies is not addressed very well in elementary school, and so excuse me, it is useful to revisit some of those things that may not have been taught in earlier grades. So in this case, we're talking about scarcity and increasing things in value and looking at past and present societies, because we're talking about a different time period when people had peddlers who went around selling things and such, and then also making connections to modern day ways that we buy and sell things. It's always good to put links in there. I do have some of the links in here, but that does help out. And referencing, if you're looking at the math standards, I'm going to pull those up real quick and show where those came from, but you include the code and then the content that's being utilized. Of course, there's 2 math standards that I felt this addressed for 4th grade. If we pull up the 4th grade math, you will see that if you go down to 4th grade, here's the codes from this, that we are having the students solve story problems, and that's kind of one of our big goals of this lesson. Our purposes, our objectives will fit this standard where they will actually solve story problems. And in terms of what kind of story problems we're looking at multi-step story problems that use multiplication and addition. Okay, so these are the standards that we're working for or working towards in this lesson. We do also address some English language arts, some literacy things in terms of the text that we utilize, so you can include that as well. But again, you don't have to use multiple standard sources, different subject areas, you can focus on just one. That is quite all right for this one. Learning objectives. This is an important component to really get down. Your learning objectives should be derived from or align with your learning standards. Okay, so when we're talking about buying and selling things, right, up here, we have a learning objective for that. They're going to share experiences with buying and selling things with a partner and with the class. If we're talking about solving multi-step story problems up here in our standards, then we are going to have an objective about buying and, or not buying, but about solving multi-step story problems. If we have an objective here about language arts, where students are using details from the text to explain something, well, they are going to do that when they make predictions, right? So all of these align with our standards in some kind of way. You shouldn't have something in your objectives that's not addressing your standards, and vice versa. The other important component of writing learning objectives is they need to be observable or measurable. And what that means is that somebody can see this happening or they can measure it through an assessment of some sort. So looking at this first one, TLW, the learner will. The learner will share experiences with buying and selling things with a partner and with the class. Okay, so that's a very observable thing. You could say the learner will share experiences with buying and selling things, but you really need to put something in there that's something we can observe. Can we see them doing that with a partner? Can we hear them doing that with the class? Yes. And so that becomes an observable component. And if you look at these other ones, these are all observable things. You can tell if students have written and shared multi-step story problems about buying and selling things, right? If we look over here at our level of Bloom's taxonomy, this refers to Bloom's taxonomy is in our presentation for this week. There's two versions of it. It can be in a circle or a pyramid. The traditional way is the pyramid, but you're seeing the circle more nowadays. What Bloom's taxonomy refers to is taxonomy of thinking. This basically refers to the rigor that's involved in, or the difficulty, or the amount of thought that goes into certain tasks and activities. If you look at these verbs here along the side or within the different sections of the wheel, these verbs are useful for writing your learning objectives, right? So we want to make sure that we're covering these. You don't have to cover all of them in a particular lesson, but we want to make sure that we're moving beyond just kind of this base level of knowledge of just memorizing things and recalling them, right? We want them to apply things. We want them to analyze situations. And so when you look back at this lesson plan, you'll see that they are sharing experiences, right, about buying and selling things. So they know about buying and selling things. They're applying that knowledge here. When they're listening to the text that you're reading to them, they're going to comprehend, and then they're going to make predictions. That's analyzing it. When they're writing their story problems, they're going to apply what they've learned. And when they write original things and illustrate them, that's a synthesis. That's the highest level, or one of the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So you want to make sure that each one of these applies directly to that and that you're addressing that. Within your learning objectives, how do they connect with the different levels of thinking? DOK is depth of knowledge. You'll get into that maybe later, but for now we'll just utilize Bloom's taxonomy to guide our thinking about how rigorous our learning experiences are for our students. Materials needed, pretty straightforward. We do utilize a text. Hopefully you've looked at the text online here beforehand, so you kind of have an idea of what's going on with this lesson plan. But it is always useful to combine things such as reading with math, things that may not normally be combined together, but it's a good way to get students engaged in applying these concepts in more real world or even imaginary setting, but connecting it to their lives and things that are a little more engaging. Instructional strategies for this section, you just list out instructional strategies that are used in this lesson. So think, pair, share, where students think about something for a minute, they pair up, and then they share their thoughts with each other. That's an instructional strategy. Having a whole group discussion is a strategy, right? And there's particular ways to go about doing that besides just having students raise their hands. Of course, that could be part of it, but that is a specific way of doing that. The read aloud, there's a certain way to read text, or there's particular ways to read text that are more engaging than just reading them straight through with students. Modeling in the mini lesson, when we actually teach the students how to do these math story problems, see what they know. That's our modeling component. And partner work, They're working with partners to write their lesson plans. For the student arrangements, you want to match up your instructional strategy with the particular student arrangement that it's utilizing. So think, pair, share. They're going to be working with a partner on the reading carpet. Right? During the read aloud, they're going to listen as a group and respond to the text while they're still at the reading carpet. This section here about learning exceptionalities and needs, this relies on some of those exceptionalities that we talked about in our projects earlier this semester. You should come up with at least 2 exceptionalities or particular needs of students within your class, and how do you respond to them. Right? The presentation for this week addresses a lot of these kind of different ways that you can accommodate or modify things for students. You want to go beyond kind of the base level of just saying, I'm going to partner them with somebody who's going to help them out. That's an important accommodation that you may put into place, but be specific about who you're going to partner them with. You may not have another adult in the room. It's easy to say a pair is going to help them out, but most of the time in schools you may not have that opportunity or resource, and so you need to be able to really give multiple things that students will be able to do. Right? So ELL students who are learning English as a second language, or as a beyond their home language, you may partner them with bilingual peers, right? But if you're going to, of course, to make sure that you repeat things, and maybe have them watch the video as well for the lesson or for the read aloud, so they really have a good idea of what happened in the book, right? Students with ADD or ADHD, these are the things that we're going to do to make sure they can stay on task during this lesson. Keywords and vocabulary, you can have a language component or a language objectives. That's good to have if you have students who are learning English throughout this, but you don't necessarily have to have that. You do need to include words that students will need to know or learn to be able to do this lesson. Your lesson sequence. This is the main activity or the main component of your lesson plan. This should be the most detailed part, and it should clearly state what the teacher is doing with each step and what the students are doing with each step. So if you read through these, it's very explicit. You will see that the instructional strategies like think, pair, share, whole class discussion, and things are mentioned. So these instructional strategies here are mentioned throughout this piece. It goes step by step from doing the read aloud, the text with the students, starting out by having them share their experiences buying and selling, starting out with stuff they know about, right, unlocking their background knowledge. We are reading the text to get them interested in these concepts. We're going to modify the story a little bit and provide a story problem in which the peddler in the story is now selling caps for different prices. We're going to provide a story problem on the board for students to read, and we're going to put student names in the story problems. Sometimes it's good to have students who may need a little more attention throughout a lesson put their name in there, right? So they can get a little more positive attention throughout that. But you're also going to have them write their own story problem, so you're modeling for them how to write a story problem with somebody from the class or from their life within that, and how story problems aren't necessarily something that just come on a worksheet, right? It's something you can create yourself. Model for them, so we're using modeling here, how to solve these story problems, get them involved in that, right? Then allow them to work in pairs to practice this a little bit for the remainder of the day. For day 2, we'll come back together with a do now. I could probably add that to the instructional strategies. That's just a short question or problem you give to the students, have them solve it to kind of make sure that they understood what we did the day before. You go around, of course, and formatively assess to make sure that they have that correct. You refer back to the directions and give them a criteria chart that it tells them the expectations. You get them into groups or into partners again, and they write their own story problems with you moving around. This is guided practice, right? You're going around and making sure they have time to practice this, but you're checking in on groups. If somebody doesn't understand something, you're making sure they do. Right? Follow-up activity, it's always good to include that. Students will solve each other's story problems off the board. Right? Forms of assessment. Formative, you're going around, you're checking to make sure that they're getting the objectives. Right? Are they learning the material? Are they mastering it? You're moving around checking them. You're asking them, thumbs up if you get this, thumbs down if you don't. Thumbs sideways if you kind of get it. The summative assessment is what we do at the end. That's the grade we give them. That's got to be based on the assessment or the requirements that you gave the students. That'll be based on the criteria chart you gave them to score their actual story problems. Right? And again, this may take more than a day or 2 days for them to work on, but it's a lesson I've used before, with a lot of success with students, and hopefully these components here help to kind of understand or help you understand how this process can come together. Thank you.